Just before Christmas, I ran a community vote and asked which arcade ports video you want to see next. This is it. This is the original 1987 Street Fighter by Capcom. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this first release, you'll notice that it's fairly bare bones to the sequel Street Fighter 2, which I've also covered in this series. We play as one character in this game and compete against various other fighters with different countries as backdrops. In terms of special moves, this game was one of the first fighting games to feature this edition. Scrolling with the original release isn't as smooth and refined as Street Fighter 2 of course, and life does deplete fairly quickly in this very challenging game too. So anyways, today we are ranking every port of this game, home computer versions largely published by US Gold and developed by Teratex. I will note that any aftermarket releases such as the Sam Coupe release will not be included. This video will solely focus on commercial year's releases. Collections for consoles will also not be mentioned because largely these are actually emulated releases, and I'll warn you now that this is likely the worst bunch of ports I've ever reviewed in this series. Okay, so to kick things off, we're starting with the C64 UK release. So this is obviously the UK version of Street Fighter. So where do I start? Let's start with a positive. The music is average for a C64 game, nothing to boast about. This is where the positives actually stop. Firstly, you'll notice the overly distorted sprites here, ugly for sure, and they seem to be from another game entirely. Looks like somebody designed the backdrops and somebody placed these sprites in place, and it just doesn't seem to match. Even the intro to fights is plastered with ugly, overpixelated pictures of the fighters. Does it control well? No, it really doesn't. Pulling off special moves here is sporadic, and you just really hope for the best with this version. The C64 re-release of this game actually came with the USA version on side B of the cassette tape, almost like they knew the British version was that awful. We can't even choose where we want to fight here like most other versions, we just get placed where the computer wants us to fight. Like I mentioned in the intro, life depletes very quickly in the arcade game. My first fight here was just like that, but much worse. Like several versions to appear in this video, fighters don't have their own backdrops, but tends to reuse particular ones over and over again. I did actually find that sometimes the opponents do sometimes appear to have a bug where you can actually beat them easily if they're in the right position when they just stand still. If you were very unfortunate to have the British version of this and was thinking the sequel would be much better a few years down the line, you seriously have my sympathy. The IBM PC compatible release lacked two essential features to make this more of an arcade experience. One, music would have been nice, and secondly, a game where hit detection would actually count. I fought several opponents with this DOS release. As I was hitting each opponent, I realised that my punches and kicks barely took anything away from the opponent's health bar. I did attempt to pull off some special moves here, but was unlucky. Of course, as to be expected, the sound effects with the DOS version wasn't particularly anything spectacular. On the plus side, I did find that the sprite design and backdrops were fairly nice here compared with other versions, although slightly pixelated. It's not a bad port, it's just a shame about the extreme difficulty level here. Oddly enough, Capcom published this version and would have thought that an issue like this would have been addressed prior to its release back in 1988. You'll also notice that for some reason the DOS conversion sprites were the smallest in all ports in this video. In terms of presentation, the Commodore Amiga conversion looked promising, but I have been there and done this before and will say now, the looks are seriously where it ends. Although like many more conversions, you'll see for this game that the difficulty level isn't as bad as some. The main issue with this Amiga game is its severe lag. It features severe input delay too. For an Amiga game, there is little features that are missing here. A higher end computer compared to 8-bit computers could have at least added some moving clouds to make it look a little bit more authentic to what it's trying to imitate. But nope, we don't even get that here with the Amiga version. Just like the MS-DOS version, this version also features 4 countries to choose from, although it is pointless because this game is just hands down diabolical. Going back to presentation, it does look faithful in a way, but for an Amiga game, the colour palette is very dull. It's just a very embarrassing conversion on a decent 16-bit computer. Shame on you, Turtex. And next up we got the Atari ST conversion. So this one is pretty much similar to the Amiga version, but not much better. Although the coders did decide to animate the clouds in this Atari ST version, it is slightly less laggy than the Amiga's conversion too. I will stress here that by no means is this port actually any good. Literally, the clouds and a fraction of less lag is how the Atari ST port got into a higher position in this video. This ZX Spectrum release wasn't a bad port compared with the previous versions. Much like other platforms, Street Fighter's difficulty levels were largely extreme to the point where almost impossible to beat other fighters. Firstly, although slightly easier with depleting enemies' life, although not really that much easier, this game is a tiny bit more playable with the fact that you're actually getting somewhere, although not too far. For those new to Spectrum games, this monochrome look isn't anything out of the ordinary. This is how most Spectrum games looked. Scrolling wise is fairly good here, sprites move around just fine, and we can actually see which moves they're pulling off. Even the screen moves from side to side, where many other versions just stayed static. Is this really a good game though? No, not at all. Not much of an upgrade so far, but we'll just say at least this Amstrad CPC conversion had colour compared with the Spectrums. Difficulty level with this port was slightly easier than the Spectrum and DOS versions, but good lord, this game is far from playable because of the Fury and radio encounter where, just like most other versions, collision detection is that bad when hitting, and when you do manage to get a hit, it just doesn't seem to count for much on their energy bars. No music here, just sound effects, which are average for an 8-bit Amstrad game. As I say, it does feature colours, but it's far from anything groundbreaking really. Generally, Amstrad CPC games look nice and colourful, but not this game. It just seems to love itself only for the sheer level of toughness. In comparison to the pitiful UK conversion for the Commodore 64, this American version wasn't actually that bad. The character sprites here are pretty top notch and intricately detailed too. The backdrops are much nicer and offering better colours too with this American port. Fighting opponents actually feels like you are getting somewhere and you can see the moves rather than just seeing a load of blocky pixel mess like the British version had. When this game loads up, it feels a little bit more authentic to what it is porting across. A nice presentation screen introduction, and we even have the ability to change difficulty modes here. It controls really nicely. The characters even come into the stages walking along before the fight begins, just like the arcade version. Kind of looks like you are jumping up and down, a bit like a kangaroo, but that's cool because that's how the arcade game looked. In terms of music, a massive improvement throughout. Yes, we do get to share backdrops here rather than each player having their own, but that's a sacrifice that some microcomputer ports had to make back in the day. And at top place in this video, I've ranked the PC Engine CD or the TurboGrafx 16 CD port. This version is actually known as Fighting Street, but it's essentially the same game. So what makes this a winner? We pretty much have the full package here. Music and sound effects are fairly close to emulating the sound of the 1987 Capcom arcade game, and it also offers a fair challenge, which is almost on par with the arcade game. So in other words, this game is playable unlike the extreme difficulty levels of most of the ports. The music production here is actually more of an enhancement over the source material. There's a slight echo when hitting opponents in this game, and it kind of sounds pretty cool. Talking about hitting, this is likely also the only version where hit collision detection is accurate too. Most other ports were really sketchy with collision detection. Controller wise, this had no input lag and plays much like the original arcade game. Out of most of these ports in this video I have showcased, they were largely produced by the infamous Tiratex. This version wasn't, and I don't really need to say any more just here. This was developed by NEC Avenue for North America release and Hudson Soft for Japan in 1988, who even included voice synth too with the PC Engine CD version. And that's it for today's ranking the Street Fighter port. So like I mentioned in the introduction, there truly was some shocking games to play just here, probably the worst I've ever done. But drop us a line in the comments and let us know which version you played as a kid. Did you like it or hate it? What was it? Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching.